Hi, I'm Site Supervisor Anna Shackelford, and I'm here at our West Tower excavation site. So we've just recently come out of hibernation for the winter. We've been out here digging for the past 2 weeks or so, depending on the weather. And what we're doing is actually gearing up to close up this excavation site. So we're coming to the very, very end. And originally we were digging here actually because in a test pit we saw evidence of burning that we thought related to Bacon's Rebellion. So now that we're coming to the end of our excavations, we have much more evidence that actually tells us this actually is from when the rebels burned down the church in 1676. So on this episode of Dig Deeper, let's go ahead and dive into what we found over here at our West Tower site. Now, while we do have lots of interesting 17th century historic deposits, there are also plenty of modern features that we had to dig through. You can see we have a couple utilities running through here. You can see I'm standing on a concrete slab. So we actually had another concrete stair up here, and we also had a brick pathway that we actually used the sledgehammer to knock through so that we could get to the historic deposits beneath. We also have multiple iterations of fence lines running through this area that are fairly modern. So the earliest one predates 1883, and it's this rail fence that was used to keep livestock away from the ruins of the church. We also have a barbed wire fence that was put in after Preservation Virginia acquired the property, again to protect the church tower and the ruins of the church. And then associated with the concrete staircase, we also have a wrought iron fence that ended up surrounding the memorial church as well. So now that we've talked about all of our modern intrusions, we can start talking about our profiles. So all of our intact strata on the wall, and we're going to start with the most recent and move to the oldest. So up top we have gravel, which is just very modern landscaping, and then beneath that we have a very thin lens of early 20th century landscaping fill. Beneath that, however, we start running into intact material from the 17th century. And the artifacts that we've gotten out of that layer are indicating its time period, which is the late 17th century. We're getting all sorts of pieces of window lead that have the dates imprinted on them. Morgan Jones pottery, which dates back to about 1677, as well as a glass bottle base, which also dated to the late 17th century. Now, in the midst of this 17th century landscaping layer, we also uncovered an intact brick pathway with row-locked bricks, very similar to one that we actually uncovered in the church cemetery a few years ago. So this intact pathway is, further evidence that this was an intact historic layer. So beneath our 17th century landscaping, we ended up running into what looked like a bunch of construction debris layers. So first off, we had a layer of fragmented and burnt oyster shell, where it looks like they were actually burning this oyster shell to produce lime in order to mix mortar. And then over here, we actually have a layer of discarded mortar and plaster. Now, both of these layers are very likely related to the construction of the brick tower behind me in the 1680s. That brings us to our Bacon's Rebellion burn layer, which is directly sealed by all of this construction debris, which helps us actually solidify that is from Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. You have this destruction event, and then the construction debris right on top in the 1680s. And you can see this burn layer is actually represented by a few different colors of deposits in the ground. So most notably, we have all of this black material, very carbon rich, the remains of the wood that burns during the fire. And this is the majority of the layer. It's about 2 inches thick. You can also see we have these patches of red throughout the unit. These are a very thin lens, only going up to maybe ½ an inch thick, very thin. This is likely the burnt scratch coat of plaster from the structure. And we also actually have intact pieces of burned plaster. Now, all of this is helping us to actually redefine our interpretation of the church on this spot and how it evolves throughout time. Now, this intact burned plaster in front of me was really the key to figure out what was going on with these patches of red. We had all sorts of theories before we found it about, what these red lenses were. But it wasn't until we actually physically found the evidence of this plaster that we could confirm that this was remnants of the burnt scratch coat. Now, there are no known illustrations that are contemporaneous with Bacon's Rebellion showing the church burning down. Instead, we have centuries of artists doing their renditions, conjectural drawings that generally show the brick church tower burning. However, with the evidence we found in the ground, we now know that this is not true. If the brick church tower burned, we would have been finding evidence of burnt mortar, burnt brick, but we weren't finding any evidence of that whatsoever. Instead, we just have the burnt plaster and the burnt wood, which is indicating more towards the 1617 timber frame church. As I mentioned before, one of the diagnostic artifacts that we were finding were window leads. And then the latest date we found on these window leads was 1693, and we know from primary records that the brick tower was being built as late as 1699. So we're absolutely certain that these window leads are from construction as opposed to destruction, especially because if they had been burned during Bacon's Rebellion, we would have seen signs of melting, and we weren't seeing any signs of that whatsoever. There's also the fact that, again, we have that construction debris right on top of the burning. So all signs, with our layers and with our artifacts are indicating that this brick church tower is actually replacing an earlier structure that burnt down. From our excavations inside the memorial church, as well as inside the church tower, we have a complete understanding of the foundations for each of the churches here. So the foundation in red is the brick church as well as the church tower, and then this yellow foundation is the 1617 church. Now, with our burnt plaster at the west tower site, we're getting a better understanding of how these churches evolve over time. So now we understand that the brick church is built around the existing timber frame, and the last bay of the timber frame, so this part sticking outside of the brick church, is actually left standing. And so that's the belfry. I'm actually standing inside of it right now, and it's actually tied into the brick church. So we believe that during Bacon's Rebellion, they're actually burning down this last existing section of the timber frame, and it falls into our west tower area, smoldering on the ground, and that causes them to have to come back in the 1680s to build the brick church tower right here. Now that we've been able to definitively date this layer behind me to Bacon's Rebellion, we've actually been able to trace it back to a single day in history. It's September 19th, 1676, which is actually rather rare in archaeology. We've also been able to significantly change our understanding of how this landscape looks throughout the 17th century. This has been an incredibly exciting excavation site, and we're hoping to do more in this area soon, so stay tuned to see what we're up to. Thank you for watching.